The sky hung heavy with thick clouds, a deep shade of gray that swallowed the last remnants of daylight. A steady drizzle coated the world in a fine mist, clinging to the trees and settling on the road in an endless, quiet rhythm. The wipers on Sarah's car swept mechanically back and forth, clearing away the water that blurred her vision, though her thoughts were already distant, wandering somewhere far from the monotonous drive home. The narrow, winding road stretched before her, empty except for the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. Trees lined both sides, their skeletal branches swaying gently in the cold evening air. The atmosphere was thick with that eerie quiet that came after a long rain, where everything felt muffled, distant, as if the world had slowed down. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel, her fingers stiff from the chill seeping into the car. The heater hummed softly, but it barely cut through the cold that clung to her skin. She exhaled slowly, watching as the fog of her breath disappeared against the dimly lit dashboard. It had been a long day, and the road stretched endlessly ahead of her, a path of solitude leading her back to the comfort of home. Then something caught her eye, a dark shape barely visible against the wet pavement just off to the side of the road. It was small, almost unnoticeable, blending seamlessly into the landscape of shadows and rain-slicked asphalt. Her foot instinctively eased off the accelerator, her heartbeat quickening as she strained to see what it was. At first, she thought it was a discarded piece of clothing or debris, a bundle of fabric abandoned by the wind. But as her headlights illuminated the scene with a fleeting burst of clarity, her stomach twisted. It wasn't debris. It was an animal. A strange, sinking feeling settled deep in her chest. The shape was unmoving, curled in on itself, as if it had collapsed mid-step. Sarah's mind whirred with possibilities. Was it alive? Had just happened? Had someone hit it and driven away? The thought made her throat tighten. Without thinking, she slowed the car to a stop, pulling over onto the gravel shoulder. The hazard lights flickered on, casting rhythmic amber flashes against the wet road, illuminating the surrounding trees in eerie bursts of light. For a long moment, she sat there, fingers frozen on the wheel, staring through the windshield. The shape remained still. The drizzle continued to tap against the glass, the world outside dim and colorless. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Finally, she pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold. The air was sharp, stinging her cheeks as she pulled her coat tighter around herself. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she hesitated for a second before walking toward the dark figure ahead. Every step felt heavy, as if the weight of the moment had settled into her very bones. As she drew closer, the shape became clearer. Her breath hitched. A small puppy lay motionless on the edge of the road. Sarah's chest constricted as she took in the fragile form. Its fur was soaked, clinging to its tiny frame, making it look even smaller than it already was. Its legs were curled inward slightly, its body slack against the damp ground. A shudder passed through her as she knelt beside it. It was still breathing. The realization sent a jolt of emotion through her, a mixture of relief and dread twisting in her stomach. The puppy's tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths, each one seeming weaker than the last. Its eyes were barely open, half-lidded with exhaustion, its body trembling violently from the cold and shock. A thin whimper escaped its throat, a faint, pitiful sound that cut through the silence like a knife. Sarah swallowed hard, blinking against the sudden sting in her eyes. "Hey," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Hey, little one, I see you." Her fingers trembled as she reached out, hesitant, unsure if touching it would cause more harm. The moment her hand brushed against the damp fur, the puppy flinched weakly, a faint spasm that made her pull back instantly. Her heart clenched. It was terrified. She let out a slow, shaky breath, her gaze sweeping over the puppy's fragile form, noting every tremor, every flicker of movement. Its tiny paws twitched slightly, as if trying and failing to push itself up. One of its hind legs lay at an awkward angle, twisted unnaturally. It had tried to get up, tried to move, but it hadn't been able to. A wave of sadness crushed her. How long had it been lying here? How many cars had passed by, pretending not to see? Another weak whimper. Sarah bit her lip, struggling to hold back the emotions that swirled inside her. She wanted to help, but she was paralyzed by fear. Fear of making it worse. Fear of touching it wrong. Fear of not knowing what to do. The rain continued to fall, colder now, heavier, slipping beneath her coat and dampening her sleeves. The world around her had faded into nothing. All that existed was this tiny, suffering creature and the unbearable weight of its pain. A car passed by in the distance, the rush of tires against wet pavement momentarily breaking the silence. Sarah barely noticed. The puppy's breathing hitched, its small frame shuddering from the effort of simply existing. She exhaled sharply, steeling herself. "You're okay," she whispered again, even though she knew it wasn't true. She could feel its faint warmth beneath her fingertips, a fragile flicker of life barely hanging on. The thought of leaving it here was unbearable, but so was the idea of hurting it further by moving it. Her mind raced for answers. The puppy whimpered once more, a barely there sound, like the last bit of strength leaving its body. Sarah's hands curled into fists at her sides, frustration and sorrow warring inside her. She had never felt so helpless, so utterly consumed by the unfairness of it all. The rain fell harder. The world stayed silent, and the puppy lay there, waiting. Sarah knelt beside it, feeling the chill seep into her bones, her hands shaking, her chest tightening with something indescribable. She didn't know what would happen next. She only knew she had found it, and that had to mean something. The cold rain drummed steadily against the roof of Sarah's car as she knelt beside the tiny, trembling puppy. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on her as the drizzle soaked through her clothes. The weak whimper that escaped the puppy's throat was barely audible over the rain, but it sent a sharp stab of urgency through her. She had to move. She had to act now. Her fingers shook as she reached for her jacket, unzipping it with stiff, clumsy hands. The cold had seeped into her skin, making every movement feel sluggish, as though the very air around her was trying to slow her down. The puppy let out another faint, pitiful sound, its tiny body shivering violently. It was soaked to the bone, its fur matted with rain and dirt, and its breathing was shallow, too shallow. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before slipping her jacket off and spreading it out on the wet pavement. The chill instantly bit at her arms, but she ignored it. Carefully, she slid her hands beneath the fragile creature, her touch as light as possible. The puppy flinched, its small muscles tensing in fear and pain. "It's okay," Sarah murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've got you." The puppy didn't resist. It didn't even have the strength to. It was so small, so impossibly light in her hands, as if it were made of nothing more than fragile bones and damp fur. The warmth of its tiny body was faint, barely noticeable against the cold bite of the night air. Sarah gently placed it onto the soft fabric of her jacket and wrapped it with slow, deliberate care. The moment the fabric covered the puppy, it let out a barely audible sigh, its trembling momentarily easing. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing back the panic clawing at her throat. She rose to her feet, cradling the bundled puppy against her chest. The weight of it felt insignificant, yet the responsibility crushed her. The rain continued to fall, soaking her exposed arms, dripping from her hair, but she barely noticed. All she could focus on was the weak rise and fall of the small body pressed against her. She hurried back to the car, her shoes slipping slightly on the wet gravel. Fumbling with one hand, she yanked open the passenger door and carefully laid the puppy on the seat, making sure the jacket was snug around it. The small creature didn't move much, just a slight twitch of its ears, a shallow breath that sent another ripple of fear through Sarah. She slammed the door shut and ran around to the driver's side, yanking it open and throwing herself into the seat. Her hands were freezing, trembling as she reached for her phone. She had to find the nearest veterinarian. She had no idea where to go. Her fingers fumbled across the screen, mistyping as her heart raced. Emergency vet near me. The search results loaded agonizingly slow. She tapped the first option that looked promising, her breath catching as she saw the distance. 13 miles. Too far. Her eyes darted to the tiny bundle on the seat. The puppy hadn't moved. She swallowed, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had no choice. She had to get there. Slamming the car into gear, she sped off, the tires splashing through puddles as she swerved back onto the road. The wipers struggled to keep up with the rain, smearing water across the glass. Her foot pressed hard against the accelerator, the speedometer creeping higher. The road twisted ahead, dark and slick, but she barely saw it. Her mind was locked on the fragile life beside her. Every second felt like an eternity. Glancing at the puppy, she saw its small chest still rising and falling, but barely. "Hold on," she whispered, as if the words alone could keep it alive. Her heart pounded harder as she pushed the car faster, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The dashboard clock blinked at her mockingly, time slipping away too quickly. Minutes passed in a blur. Then, finally, a red neon sign in the distance. 24-hour emergency vet. Relief surged through her, but it was quickly drowned by renewed urgency. She swerved into the parking lot, the tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement as she threw the car into park. She barely remembered yanking open the door, barely remembered scooping up the bundled puppy, holding it tight to her chest as she sprinted toward the entrance. The cold air burned her lungs, but she didn't stop. The glass doors slid open, flooding her with too bright fluorescent light. A receptionist looked up, startled by the sight of her, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, clutching the tiny, motionless bundle. "Please," Sarah gasped, her voice breaking. "Help!" The woman behind the counter sprang into action, calling into the back. Within seconds, a vet tech rushed forward, her eyes immediately locking onto the bundle in Sarah's arms. "What happened?" the tech asked urgently, already reaching for the puppy. Sarah couldn't form words. She felt the weight leave her arms as the tech carefully took the tiny, wrapped body and rushed down the hall. Sarah stood frozen, the wet fabric of her shirt clinging to her skin, the room spinning slightly. "Miss," the receptionist's voice pulled her back. "Can you fill this out?" A clipboard was pushed into her trembling hands. Her fingers barely worked as she gripped the pen, staring blankly at the paper. Name? She didn't even know the puppy's name. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to write Sarah Carter in shaky letters. Her breath was still uneven, her chest rising and falling too fast. The doors to the back swung open, and a tall man in scrubs walked out, wiping his hands on a towel. He glanced at the receptionist, then at Sarah. "You brought the puppy in?" he asked. Sarah nodded stiffly, her throat too tight to speak. He sighed, running a hand through his short hair. "It's bad," he said. Sarah's stomach dropped. "He's weak, malnourished. We're stabilizing him now," but he hesitated, then looked at her carefully. "Are you sure you want to do this? Treatment is going to be expensive. If you're just a passerby—" "Yes," Sarah interrupted, the word escaping before she could think. "I'll do whatever it takes." The vet studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right," he said. "Let's get started." Sarah exhaled a shaky breath, her hands still trembling as she tightened her damp coat around herself. The humiliation of standing there, drenched, desperate, with no plan, no idea what she was doing. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except that tiny, broken puppy, and she wasn't going to leave it alone. The waiting room felt colder than it should have. Sarah sat stiffly on the edge of a hard plastic chair, her fingers gripping the damp fabric of her sleeves, her whole body trembling from a combination of wet clothes, exhaustion, and the unbearable weight of uncertainty. The clinic smelled of antiseptic, a sterile sharpness that mixed with the faint scent of fur and disinfectant. The fluorescent lighting overhead buzzed faintly, casting an artificial glow over the polished white tiles and rows of empty chairs. She had been here for what felt like hours, though she had lost track of time the moment she had handed the tiny, broken body to the vet tech. Her soaked jeans clung uncomfortably to her skin, her damp shirt sticking to her arms, but she couldn't care less. The only thing she could focus on was the last image she had of the puppy. The way its frail body had barely moved, the shallow, erratic rise and fall of its tiny chest, the way its ears had twitched slightly, as if reacting to something unseen before going utterly still in her arms. She had done everything she could, but was it enough? Or had she only prolonged the inevitable? Her stomach twisted painfully as the thought gripped her, sinking deep into her bones. She had told herself she was saving him, that she had acted quickly, that she had done the right thing. But had she? What if she had only made things worse? What if, by moving him, she had pushed his fragile body beyond its limit? She clenched her jaw, inhaling sharply through her nose, forcing the panic down, but it refused to dissipate. Every minute that passed stretched endlessly, her anxiety growing heavier with each second of silence. The clinic staff moved behind the reception desk, shuffling papers, answering phones, tending to other patients, but no one came to tell her anything. The door to the back room swung open, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A man in scrubs stepped out, clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable. He scanned the room briefly before locking eyes with her, and she immediately shot to her feet, her legs stiff from sitting so long. "Miss Carter." She nodded quickly, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. The vet sighed, glancing down at his clipboard before meeting her eyes again. "The puppy is alive," he said, and for a moment, relief flooded through her, a dizzying rush that made her knees feel weak. But then he continued, "He's in critical condition. His body temperature was dangerously low when he arrived. We've stabilized him for now, but he's suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition. There's an infection. We're treating it with antibiotics, but it's advanced. His organs are under extreme stress." Sarah felt her breath hitch, her throat tightening unbearably. The vet hesitated for a brief moment before adding, "His chances of survival, they're not good." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She had known, deep down, she had known from the moment she saw him lying there on the side of the road, so fragile and broken, that it was bad. But hearing it confirmed, laid out so clinically, so plainly, made it feel unbearable. She swallowed hard, trying to push through the suffocating weight of helplessness pressing down on her. "But there's a chance?" she asked, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. The vet exhaled slowly, nodding. "There's a chance," he admitted, "but it's very slim. We're doing everything we can, but right now, all we can do is wait and see how he responds to treatment." Sarah clenched her hands into fists, nails digging into the damp fabric of her sleeves. "I want to see him." The vet hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Follow me." She followed him through the doors, her heart hammering as they entered the back area of the clinic. The scent of antiseptic was stronger here, mixing with the faint hum of medical equipment. The hall was lined with kennels, some occupied by other animals. Dogs recovering from surgeries, cats curled up beneath heat lamps. But Sarah barely registered them. Then they stopped. The vet stepped aside, gesturing toward a small incubator positioned against the far wall. Inside, lying on a soft white towel, was the tiny puppy. Sarah's breath caught. He was even smaller than she remembered, his fragile body barely visible beneath the tubes and medical wires attached to him. And Four-Line was taped carefully to one of his front legs, delivering fluids into his system. His fur, now clean of dirt and rain, was still damp, revealing just how thin he really was, every rib visible beneath the pale skin. He wasn't moving. For one terrifying moment, she thought he was already gone, but then she saw it, the tiniest, faintest movement of his chest as he took a shallow breath. "He's very weak," the vet said gently, as if sensing her distress. "But he's holding on." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and stepped closer, pressing her hand lightly against the incubator's clear plastic surface. The warmth radiating from inside was meant to keep his body temperature stable, but his tiny form still trembled slightly, as if even in sleep he was struggling. She couldn't take her eyes off him. He was fighting. Even after everything, even after being left alone in the cold, after whatever pain he had endured, he was still fighting. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, but she refused to let them fall. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, that she would stay strong for him. He's got someone pulling for him now, the vet said quietly. Sarah inhaled deeply, steadying herself. I want to stay. The vet studied her for a moment before nodding. We have a waiting area back here, he said. It might be a long night. Sarah just nodded, unwilling to take her eyes off the fragile life in front of her. The vet placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before walking away, leaving her alone with the sound of the machines and the steady, rhythmic beeping of the monitors tracking the puppy's heartbeat. She pulled a chair closer to the incubator and sat down, resting her arms on her lap, watching him breathe. He wasn't out of danger, not even close, but he wasn't alone anymore. And no matter what happened, she wasn't leaving. The days inside the veterinary clinic stretched into a grueling, endless cycle of waiting, hoping, and tending to the fragile creature that clung desperately to life. Sarah never left his side. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a steady, artificial brightness that made it impossible to tell whether it was day or night. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, a constant reminder of how precarious his condition remained. The puppy was still weak, too weak to move on his own. His body remained curled in a fragile, unmoving state inside the incubator, wires attached to his tiny frame. The slow, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, the only proof that he was still alive. His breathing was shallow, his body temperature unstable, and every hour that passed felt like a silent war being waged against the infection that threatened to shut down his organs completely. Sarah sat in the same chair every day, her fingers clutching the edges of her sleeves, watching as the veterinary team worked tirelessly to stabilize him. The 4-drip remained hooked into his tiny front leg, delivering the crucial fluids he needed to stay alive. A clear tube led to his nose, supplying oxygen, ensuring that his weakened body didn't have to struggle for every breath. The antibiotics were administered with precision, injected carefully into his system at regular intervals, a desperate attempt to fight off the raging infection that still coursed through his frail body. Each dose was a battle, a gamble, a plea for his body to respond, to accept the medicine and give him a chance. Some days, his vitals would improve slightly, offering the smallest glimmer of hope. Other days, he would slip back into a frightening stillness, his breathing becoming so faint that Sarah would lean in, pressing her fingers lightly against the incubator, straining to see the fragile movement of his chest. The clinic staff came and went, their faces a blur of tired expressions and soft voices. They adjusted the 4 drips, monitored his hydration levels, ran blood tests, and administered pain medication to ease the strain his body was under. They spoke in hushed tones, careful not to give false hope, but also unwilling to suggest giving up. For days, he remained in this state, motionless, caught in the delicate balance between survival and surrender. Sarah refused to leave. She barely slept, her head resting against the edge of the incubator as she listened to the steady, mechanical sounds of the monitors. Her body ached from exhaustion, but the thought of walking away, of leaving him alone, was unbearable. Every few hours, a vet tech would approach, offering her a bottle of water, a cup of coffee, a quiet reminder that she should eat something, sleep for a while, take a break. But Sarah would only shake her head, her eyes never leaving the fragile body in front of her. She wasn't going anywhere. The 4 bags needed to be replaced frequently, one after the other, clear fluids dripping steadily into his veins. His body was dangerously dehydrated, unable to take in nutrients on its own. The vet explained how his organs had been under extreme stress, how his tiny frame had been pushed past its limits from prolonged exposure to the cold and untreated wounds. Without the 4, he wouldn't survive. Each morning, the veterinarians would check his vitals, reading the charts carefully, analyzing his response to the treatment. Some days, his fever would rise, sending his body into shivering fits, despite the warmth of the incubator. More antibiotics, more fluids, more waiting. The infection was relentless. It took hold of his weakened body, threatening to consume what little strength he had left. The staff monitored him around the clock, adjusting the dosages of his medication, making sure his fragile immune system had the best possible chance of fighting back. Time blurred. Sarah lost track of the days, her world reduced to the beeping machines, the slow drip of the careful hands of the veterinary staff as they worked to keep him alive. The sight of needles piercing his fragile skin made her chest tighten, but she knew it was necessary. The antibiotics burned as they entered his system. She could see the way his small body tensed involuntarily each time a new dose was administered. The vet assured her that he was being given pain medication, that they were doing everything they could to keep him comfortable. But it didn't stop the gnawing guilt, the overwhelming helplessness of watching him suffer. He was too weak to even make a sound. Sarah sat by his side, whispering to him even though she wasn't sure he could hear her. Her voice was raw, hoarse from days of not speaking to anyone but him. She told him stories about nothing in particular, talked about the rain, the wind, the world outside the clinic walls. Anything to fill the silence. Anything to keep herself from drowning in the unbearable stillness. The veterinary team continued their relentless efforts, working in shifts, making sure there was always someone monitoring his progress. They adjusted the incubator's temperature, ensuring that his body remained warm enough to support healing. They checked his glucose levels, worried about malnutrition, knowing that his body was surviving solely off the fluids being pumped into him. More tests, more waiting. Sarah's fingers curled into fists whenever she heard the quiet discussions between the staff. Words like prognosis uncertain, still critical. We have to be prepared. She knew what they meant. She knew they were warning her. But she refused to listen. Not yet. Not when he was still fighting. She watched every movement, every tiny shift in his breathing, searching for any sign, any proof that he wasn't giving up. She ignored the exhaustion pulling at her, ignored the aching stiffness in her limbs. The antibiotics continued their slow war against the infection. The machines continued their quiet beeping, a constant reminder that life still lingered. And Sarah remained at his side, unmoving, unwavering, waiting, fighting, refusing to let go. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant promise of rain. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly as she pulled into the familiar parking lot of the veterinary clinic. The gray sky mirrored the uncertainty churning inside her, a quiet reflection of the long, exhausting battle that had consumed her life for weeks. She turned off the engine, sitting motionless for a moment, staring at the building in front of her. How many times had she walked through those doors, heart pounding, bracing herself for the worst? How many times had she held her breath as the vet delivered updates, each word carrying the weight of life or death? Even now, after all this time, the fear remained. It lived in the tightness of her chest, in a nervous tremble of her hands as she reached for the door handle. But today was different. Today, she wasn't preparing for bad news. Today, she was hoping, truly hoping, that the worst was behind them. She stepped out of the car, pulling her coat tighter around herself as a cool breeze swept through the lot. The clinic entrance loomed ahead, a place that had once been filled with nothing but dread. Now, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were finally changing. Pushing through the glass doors, she was immediately greeted by the familiar sterile scent of antiseptic and the soft murmur of voices behind the reception desk. The walls, the chairs, the bright fluorescent lights, everything looked the same. Yet to Sarah, it all felt different now. The receptionist glanced up, smiling warmly. "You're here to see Chiquis?" Chiquis. The name still felt new on her tongue, yet it belonged to him now. It had been given in whispers, in moments of desperate encouragement as she sat by his incubator, willing him to keep fighting. It had started as something small, a way to remind herself that he wasn't just a patient, not just a fragile body struggling to survive. He was Chiquis. He was hers. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she expected. "How is he today?" The receptionist's smile widened. "Go see for yourself." Something in her tone made Sarah hesitate. A flicker of something unspoken, something just beneath the surface. Her pulse quickened as she turned toward the hallway, her feet moving faster now, her heart hammering in her chest. She had walked this hall so many times before, each step usually filled with dread. But this time it was different. This time, anticipation filled the air. She reached the doorway to the recovery room, her fingers gripping the frame as she peered inside. And then, her breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't move. She couldn't think. Because there he was, not lying still, not struggling for breath, not barely clinging to life. Shakis was standing. More than that, he was running. The moment he saw her, his small, fragile body moved with a burst of energy she had never seen before. His tiny paws pattered against the tile as he ran toward her, ears flopping, tail wagging furiously behind him. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, a choked sound escaping her throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then, he was there. Before she could react, before she could even process what was happening, Shakis threw himself against her legs, pressing his small body against her, as if he had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. His tail wagged so hard it sent his entire body into a wiggling frenzy, his bright, eager eyes looking up at her, filled with something she had never dared to hope for. Joy. Pure, unfiltered joy. A sob ripped from Sarah's chest as she dropped to her knees, reaching for him with trembling hands. The moment her fingers touched his fur, he wiggled closer, nuzzling against her palms, his tiny body radiating warmth, life, energy. She laughed, the sound shaky and wet with tears. Oh my God, Shakis! His paws scrambled against her jeans as he tried to climb in her lap, licking her fingers, her wrist, anywhere he could reach. The little whimpers that once had been filled with pain were now excited, happy, filled with something that had once seemed impossible. Sarah buried her face into his soft fur, inhaling deeply, letting the warmth of him sink into her. He smelled like medicine, like the clinic, like life. He was here. He was really here. She pulled back slightly, cupping his tiny face in her hands, searching his eyes for any sign of the weakness that had once kept him confined to the incubator. But there was none. He was still small, still delicate, but he was strong now. His body, once frail and motionless, now vibrated with energy. You did it, she whispered, pressing a kiss to his head, her tears falling freely now. You really did it. Behind her, the vet stood watching, a small smile on his face. He's been waiting for you all morning, he said. Sarah let out a breathless laugh, wiping at her wet cheeks. I can't believe this, she admitted. I know, the vet said gently. But he fought, and so did you. She looked back down at Shakis, who was still wiggling excitedly in her arms, his tail thumping against her side. You saved him, the vet added. Sarah shook her head, holding the puppy closer. No, she whispered. He saved himself, and for the first time in weeks, she truly believed it. Shakis had been broken, weak, barely holding on. But he had fought through the pain, through the exhaustion, through the endless days of treatment and needles and medication. He had come back from the edge of death, stronger than anyone had expected. And now he was running. Sarah lifted him into her arms, holding him against her chest as he wiggled happily, his tiny paws pressing against her like he never wanted to let go. She knew, in that moment, that she would never let go either. The road had been long. The fight had been brutal. But standing here, holding him, feeling his warmth, his love, his life, she knew without a doubt that every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of fear and pain had been worth it. Because Shakis had won, and so had she. The drive home felt surreal. Sarah kept glancing at the passenger's seat, half expecting Shakis to disappear, to wake up and realize this had all been a dream. But he was there, small, real, and full of life. He sat curled up on a soft blanket she had laid out for him, his bright eyes watching the world pass by through the window, his tiny ears twitching at every new sound. He had never seen the world like this before, not from a place of safety, not with someone who cared. Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel, swallowing down the lump in her throat. They had come so far. For weeks, Chiquise had known nothing but pain, nothing but the cold sterility of the clinic, the endless cycle of treatments, injections, the beeping machines that dictated whether he lived or died. And before that, before she had found him on the side of the road, what had he known? Hunger, fear, neglect, maybe even cruelty. But today, everything was different. Today, he was going home. When she pulled into the driveway, Sarah turned off the engine and exhaled slowly, steadying herself before reaching over to unbuckle Chiquise from the small travel carrier the clinic had given her. The moment she opened the door, he stretched his tiny paws, yawning as if this was the most natural thing in the world. She let out a quiet laugh, lifting him gently into her arms. "Welcome home, little guy," she whispered. She carried him inside carefully, cradling him close as she stepped into the warmth of her home. The familiar scent of her space wrapped around her, a contrast to the cold, clinical smells of the vet's office. She had prepared everything, his bed, his bowls, the softest blankets she could find. But now that she was here, standing in the middle of her living room with him in her arms, she realized just how much this moment meant. She wasn't just bringing home a dog. She was bringing home a survivor. Chiquise blinked up at her, tilting his small head, and for the first time, he didn't look like a dog who had been broken. He looked curious, hopeful. She set him down gently on the floor, and he hesitated for only a second before taking a few cautious steps, sniffing at the air, at the furniture, at the newness of it all. Then, something incredible happened. He turned back to her, tail wagging ever so slightly, and took a few wobbly steps toward her. Not out of fear, not because he was searching for safety, but because he trusted her. Sarah felt the sting of tears again, but this time, she let them fall. That first night, Chiquise slept curled up beside her on the couch, tucked into the crook of her arm, his small breaths steady and warm against her skin. She had set up a bed for him, given him every comfort she could think of, but he had chosen her, and she had chosen him. Recovery wasn't instant. The scars he carried, both the ones on his body and the invisible ones beneath the surface, would take time to heal. At first, he was hesitant about loud noises, flinching at sudden movements, shrinking back when a shadow passed too quickly across the room. He didn't know how to play, didn't understand that food would always be there now, that he never had to fight for survival again. Sarah was patient. She fed him by hand when he was too nervous to eat from a bowl, sat with him for hours when the memories of fear seemed to pull him back into himself. She never forced him, never rushed him. She let him decide when he was ready, let him set the pace. Slowly, he began to change. His movements became more confident, his tail wagging more often. He learned to associate her footsteps with warmth, with food, with safety. He stopped flinching when she reached out to pet him, instead leaning into her touch, closing his eyes in quiet contentment. One evening, as Sarah sat reading on the couch, she felt something soft press against her leg. She looked down to find Chiquise staring up at her, his tiny paws resting on her knee. Then, he licked her hand. It was small, a single, hesitant lick. But to Sarah, it was everything. It was trust. She scooped him up into her arms, holding him close, and for the first time since this journey had begun, she let herself believe that they had truly won. Weeks turned into months, and Chiquise became unrecognizable from the fragile, terrified creature she had once found on the side of the road. He grew stronger, more playful, his tail wagging at the sight of her every morning, his bright eyes no longer dulled by pain. And Sarah? Sarah couldn't imagine life without him. She had saved him, but in so many ways, he had saved her too. They had both been broken once. But together, they had found something neither of them had ever expected. Home.